Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and today I'm back to testing materials for face-ups, this time using Arteza's Gouache paint. I'll be starting with using it on a resin BJD with Robin, my Doll Family A practice head. I know I said I'd be doing videos where I tested them on both resin and vinyl dolls in one video, but that was before I realized the videos were going to end up being longer than 10 minutes each, so as long as the videos keep running long, I'll keep splitting resin and vinyl into their own videos, so that I can be as thorough as possible. When these paints arrived, one of the first things I did was make a swatch sheet. The sheet didn't go too well at first, because I didn't realize my table wasn't level, so my water kept running up into the swatches and pooling and generally making a mess of things, so I didn't end up with a whole lot of smooth gradients on my test paper. But this does give me an idea of what each color will actually look like, which is pretty important. So, like the watercolor pencils I reviewed last time, the gouache comes stamped with information right on the tube. You've got the color name on top and the color number on the bottom. This number is consistent through products, so if you see A115 on a tube of paint and on a pencil, they're made with the same pigments, and they'll be similar in color. Not exactly the same because binding agents affect the final color, but they'll be close. The plus marks on the left are the light fastness rating. The box in the middle is the opacity rating. The fuller the box, the more opaque a paint is. And to the right is information on which specific pigments are in a paint. So here's Robin, who has been sealed with Mr. Super Clear. There's a bit of residue between the lips from the last face-up I did, but it's not going to impact the testing of these, so I didn't bother trying to strip the old sealant after I washed off the watercolor pencil. I already have some colors out on a palette from working on a painting that I'll probably share in a couple days, just because. So since I've got some good colors for face-ups on my palette already, I'll just reactivate them with water and get to playing around. If you aren't familiar with gouache, a lot of people describe it as a mix between the features of acrylic and watercolor paint. Gouache is a water-based paint that is very safe for dolls. It thins easily with water to give transparent colors, but it can also be used less diluted to give opaque color. The opacity comes from the inclusion of chalk in the paint, which gives it a beautiful matte texture. Like watercolor paints, you can reapply water to your palette or your work surface at any time to make the colors workable again after they've dried out. This is one of the reasons I particularly love gouache for making custom colors, because after it dries out, I can scrape the dry paint off my palette and into a container and keep it indefinitely. So I'm not doing anything too serious here, just checking to see how the color looks at different layers of opacity, seeing how it feels when doing lashes, seeing how well it layers over itself. The color I'm using now is a custom mix of the burnt umber I showed a minute ago and black. All of these paints have a really similar texture, the only differences are the opacity of the colors. So how one color feels thinned out is pretty consistent with how all of the others will too. I don't spend a lot of time goofing around on dolls, so letting loose and messing with different shapes and strokes is pretty fun. I'm going to give him some tusks, because why not? You're half orc now, Robin. Sorry you had to find out this way. And that's actually kind of cute. I didn't expect that. The thinner the paint is, the harder it is to control, but it does retain some opacity even when thinned. I think I'm gonna make a scar through his eyebrow. Orcs have scars, right? Rune has scars too. Rune has nasty scars that I didn't put on his doll version because he's too pretty, but I'm gonna change that eventually, maybe when I redo him this summer. Okay, I think that's enough of the orc boy, so this is my actual favorite part of gouache paint right here, how easily it comes off. I'm using a cotton swab with a little clean water on it, and even though this gouache is dark, layered on, and totally dry at this point, you can see that it just wipes off beautifully. This is the biggest reason I've switched to using mostly gouache in my face-ups, because it's so easy to remove and correct mistakes without having to reseal anything afterward. A couple swipes with water and the doll is clean. Totally clean. Even tricky places like the deep part between the lips is easy to clean, because I can just give it a quick scrub with a wet paintbrush and it's all gone. So you can see the problems I had with my swatch sheet because it was tilted, so the thinner parts were able to run up into the thicker parts. Yeah, it's ugly, but at least I figured out the problem. I'll redo this sheet eventually, but here's why it's important to have. If you were looking at the label color of this particular tube of paint, you'd probably think it'd be down here with the mauves and soft purpley pinks. Nope, this is actually a super bright neon pink way up here. So be sure to swatch your colors so you don't end up with surprises when you're doing face-ups. When I put gouache on my palette for face-ups, I like to use the tiniest bit of paint. This is actually more than I wanted and more than I needed. Then I add 1 or 2 drops of water, and that's about it. You can see on my other palette that I have the color kind of spread out. That's so I can have a thicker, bolder color and a thinner one ready to go, both at the same time. These thin really easily and don't take a lot of mixing straight out of the tube, which is nice. One problem you can find with cheaper gouache is that they can be super chalky, and that gives them kind of a gritty texture that's not really pleasant to work with, especially on dolls. But these are all really buttery smooth with a texture similar to acrylic when they're straight out of the tube. Then when you water them down, they feel more like watercolor, so it's pretty neat. One thing I wish I could do with gouache that I can't is gradients without my airbrush. Gouache is great to use with airbrushes, but I can't carry the compressor up to my new studio on my own, so I'll have to talk about that more another time. While I can get a nice, smooth base color, brushing more wet color over the top tends to reactivate what's underneath, and makes it really hard to get any kind of smooth color blend. This is not unusual for gouache though, so it's not unique to this brand. If you want to layer colors, the base needs to be your lightest, thinnest coat, and it needs to be totally dry. Then you can put darker, thicker gouache on top. But that doesn't give you the finesse for blending on a single layer. You can probably build up gradients through layers of sealant just fine, but that doesn't give you as smooth of a result as single layer blending. So airbrushes are still the best for gradation with gouache. When I first reactivated my black paint for these eyelashes, I didn't have quite enough paint reactivated and the color was a little thin. So to get that sharp, bold eyeliner color, it's probably best to use the paint straight from the tube. See, that's way better. I'll do another brow here to see how much I can get layered on together. Like with the black, I didn't reactivate this very well, so this brown looks a little lumpy. But that's me, not the paint. It takes more than a few seconds for the paint to absorb the water and reactivate. I didn't give it long enough to sit. Once it's fully reactivated, it's much, much smoother. Gouache gets crackly and flaky when it dries on a palette, so you get these little lumps and clumps of paint that don't dissolve quite as fast. I really wanted to be able to put some lighter lines over the dark, but that means more water in the mix, and you can see how well that goes. I know I just talked about how you have to layer thick over thin, but I always feel like showing exactly what happens is important because then you can not do that. Fortunately, it's easy to clean back off. So I'm gonna put some squiggly looking mess back up here for a second. Then the last thing I felt is worth mention is the way that the gouache reacts to chalk pastel going on the same layer. Because of the chalk content of the paint, gouache is really toothy, and pastel loves to stick to it. This can be good or bad depending on what you're trying to do. I'm using the same pink on the lips and the cheeks, and you can see it adheres way more intensely to the lips, where the gouache is, than it does to the cheeks, where it's only covered with MSC. But if you dust pastel over the gouache, it clings so heavily that it can and will change the color of your paint lines, and that is not the color pastel I thought I grabbed for the eyebrow, okay? Good thing this was just a test and not a real face-up, right? Ugh. I'm making a huge mess of this face now because I've got chalk pastel on my glove and it's rubbing all over the head. Oh well, we're about done with this test anyway. You can see where I've put some pastel over the pearly silver gouache lines on the eyelid, and that gave them a really cool effect. So the clingy pastel is definitely a useful tool. On the whole, I've found this gouache really smooth, easy to work with, easy to thin, easy to remove, and it has enough of a pigment load that I feel it works really well for the fine detail lines like lashes. These would look even better if I'd let the paint soak a little longer like I did with the Orc Faces brown-black paint. So, like with the watercolor pencils, I'd say Arteza gouache paints are a great addition to my toolbox, and I can definitely recommend them for face-ups. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.